Thank you very much, Elaine and Helen. Apologies, I wasn't here for your opening remarks because I was taking part in questions in the Dáil chamber. But I have read your opening statements, and they present a very dark picture in regard to different, very, very important issues that affect people, particularly vulnerable people and people maybe on less well-off people in financial terms as well, and people who suffer particular challenges. Could I just, in making a few comments, and maybe you'd respond then, taking into account that I haven't heard all of your contribution, could I just say that I remember very well when the Good Friday Agreement was achieved and agreed. At that time, the like of Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair as the heads of government, they would have stated very, very clearly at that time there's a huge obligation on governments, on political parties, on society to implement in full the Good Friday Agreement. It was never an end in itself. To a certain extent, it was a beginning of a new dispensation on this island that has been transformative, and we know it hasn't been implemented in full, but there have been huge benefits have been derived for all of our communities right throughout this island, and of course in the Irish-British relationship as well. I remember meeting some of the people who were on the Civic Forum at the time, and they were enthused about the work and the potential of that Civic Forum. And to my memory, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, again, it was the major political parties that didn't want its existence.
Yes.
They really put an end to it, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And you know, Elaine, I think you said that people talk about a Civic Forum being unrepresentative. Now, there are some political parties, no matter what issue arises here, that call for a citizens' assembly. I question how representative they are, but on every single issue, they talk about a citizens' assembly to take in people who have no expertise in that particular area. I think if we need meaningful dialogue and discussion, we should have people with a particular know-how who can bring their own experience of the particular issue and expertise to the debate. So for political parties to talk about a civic forum being unrepresentative, it's up to the system to ensure that a civic forum is represented with the different sectors.
Yeah.
Be it trade unions, be it women's groups, be it voluntary groups, sporting groups, youth groups, all of that, and to ensure that there's balance socio-economic where the people come from as well. That's easily achieved, so it is. There's no doubt about that. But that's just a political will to ensure that it doesn't exist. In the subsequent agreements, and I think I'm not sure what this Stormont House agreement or the Fresh Start agreement, there was provision made for a civic panel. Now, to my knowledge, that has gone nowhere.
No.
I'll just ask you to maybe make a few comments on my questions at the end. Now, as in regard to the Bill of Rights, I always understood that the British government would need to agree to that as well, and naturally the proposal has to come from Stormont. And again, most of the issues that you highlight there, they're devolved matters, and a matter for the Executive and the Assembly in the North to resolve. We can, all of us, say that it's up to the British government, up to the Irish government to do this, that or the other, to deal with particular issues. But those issues that are highlighted in the clear statements of both of you is their local devolved issues that need funding, that need leadership, that need direction, and that need commitment. And one particular phrase that's used that I would have concern about is where you mention about a carved up between the two major parties, a carve up between the two main parties. That has to be concerning, so it does. And you know, I think, Helen, you were obviously involved with the Women's Coalition. I have great regard for the work that they did in the talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement and subsequently as well. And we had a meeting at the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly in Stormont in early March of 2023, and we brought the Women's Coalition, members of that coalition, to talk to us about their experiences and the particular challenging work that they had to do to get others to buy in to the agenda that you outlined there, that's not complete yet or far from it, but on the issues that need to be addressed. With regard to we have particular challenges here, as Deputy Tully said, in childcare and housing and all of that, but the challenges facing your society are much more difficult, so they are, And I remember, I think it was Dr. Fitzpatrick of Ulster University, he or she outlined to us clearly the lack of a policy even in regard to childcare, never mind adequate funding. Like, we have made huge progress in childcare, and we still have challenges because we don't have enough workers to work in the sector. But again, there are issues that have to be resolved locally. And could I just ask you in conclusion then, obviously your funding there's no stability to the funding that your organisations and sister organisations get. Your parent department, is that Department of Communities, or who takes the lead in regard to providing funding and supporting your work and the work of your sister organisations? And what type of relationship have you or your other organisations have with the Communities Department or with the relevant minister? And has any meaningful effort been made by either Sinn Féin or the DUP to ensure that adequate funding is put in the way of your organisation that are providing important services on a daily basis to people who need help, who are vulnerable and who are disadvantaged in so many ways? And we're all delighted that Stormont Assembly is up and running, that the executive is up and running, but it's depressing to read at times that there's very little regard given to the debates that the opposition, the SDLP, bring forward, and practically nil participation by the parties who are in the executive in relation to those particular issues and those debates. If government is to function, the work of the opposition has to be respected. There has to be engagement. That happens in these chambers every day, with us in our Dáil chamber, in our Shannon chamber, and in our various committees as well, where there's robust and strong debate, as it should be, between government and opposition. So I just compliment you on your work and all your organisations as well. And if either Helen or Lynn wants to make a few comments on the issues that I have raised, we'd be glad to hear you.
Yeah, certainly, because I mentioned the sectarian carve-up, and that's exactly what is happening. Whoever's in power, if something would go, if there's a healthy living centre to be built in a Protestant area, there'd be one built in a Catholic area, even though there's stones thrown away from each other. So, and that is the sort of activity that's happening. We recently had a council in Newtonabbey who gave £80,000 for bonfires in exchange for them not putting flags up in the area so that the place would be more welcoming for tourists, because it is in the tourist track. So these are the sort of things that are happening. There is no accountability, and that's, I think, what the Civic Forum could have helped provide in that question and leading the way. So the leadership is really poor. There is zero accountability, and it's quite stagnant, really, what does happen up there. You know, they seem to be feel that they're above the law in some way, that they set it and they run with it. So our funders would mainly be the Department of Communities, but we're also funded through Department of Finance, Department of Justice. So all of those small pockets of money, there's nobody taking full responsibility. The Department of Communities recently gave some uplifts around funding to community centres and women's centres during COVID, but none of that has been sustained. There is funding structures that are set up, the neighbourhood renewals that are set up over 25 years ago to deal in areas of high deprivation, but there's actually deprivation outside of those areas as well, but that structure's not changing because it's held within, I don't know if you would say, single identity groups hold on to it, and nobody wants to lose their funding. So it's not very transparent, and there's no accountability. So if you're in an area where, like South Belfast, we would have 5 or 6 political parties, we would struggle to get funding outside of what is already given because it's going into the neighbourhood renewal areas. So there's a lot of things that are under review as well. We don't have much hope that it's actually going to create the change that we need, because there is no accountability and the transparency of what's happening. It is a bleak picture, you know.
Thanks, Helen.
Yes, I A couple of things. So just picking up on what Helen's saying and going a little further about funding and the relationship with Department for Communities and so forth, it's worth saying that quite a lot of the work that we're doing in our organisations is funded by charities. Both myself and Helen are 100% funded by charitable trusts. None of that whatsoever comes from government. Many of my colleagues are funded by a kind of patchwork coming from different government departments or arm's length bodies of government departments like the Public Health Agency, PHA, an arm's length body of Department for Health. But for example, Department for Health was funding little small pieces of sort of staff funding or core funding, which last September was ended entirely. And this connects into the issue of, like, so many of the issues we're describing are devolved issues. I agree with you completely. One of the big problems is a culture of kind of unaccountability, and also there's a degree to which the lack of money is used as an excuse for everything. So last financial year, 2023 to 24, when there was no executive in place, the budget was set by the Secretary of State, and cuts had to be made, significant cuts to every single government department, and those decisions were made by civil servants. One of the things they did was they cut that Department for Health core grant to quite a lot of organisations, including my own, but including the only state funding at all that was received by the Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland. It's now the only Women's Aid Federation on these islands that doesn't receive any state funding at all. It causes ongoing problems because sometimes that's the funding upon which they then apply for programme costs to actually deliver things. That's the funding that keeps the staff in place. So they're not the only ones by any means, but it's just a really good example. It illustrates what happens when that core funding goes. And the argument for almost every cut that happens, and it is cut upon cut upon cut, if you ever get an uplift, it's immediately taken away at the end of any crisis. And realistically, by keeping things exactly the same, it's an effective cut anyway, but usually it's a cut. Deliver more with less every time. One of the issues there is the argument always comes down to there isn't enough money. And I know that there's a recent sort of fiscal framework being set up in agreement with the Treasury Department over in Westminster, around restructuring how Northern Ireland is funded, so the Barnett consequential, which will be changed to reflect need in Northern Ireland and what powers are devolved and what aren't. Wales did a similar agreement where it's basically 115% of what's received per head in England, and the Northern Ireland one for the moment is 124. But I mean, the argument would be that still doesn't meet the level of need. It would be if we were starting from zero, but we're starting from behind, far behind. But still, even with that agreement in place, and even with various other, I suppose, financial ongoings whereby money's coming in to stabilise and normalise and modernise these departments, apparently, none of that's been spent yet, and we don't know how it's going to be spent, but it won't be coming down to people like myself and Helen and our organisations. There is an overall approach from the executive, which is very much, and it goes to your question about our relationship with the minister for the various departments. They will come to us and ask us to work on strategies that they want to produce because they've agreed to do it in some agreement, be it New Decade, New Approach, or Fresh Start, or whatever. They'll come to you for your work. They will contribute nothing financially to your organisation. They will take your time, and then that strategy may or may not ever see the light of day. In the last mandate, we spent 2 years, my organisation, me personally, working on a gender equality strategy. I don't know where that is. And when the executive was reinstated and a new minister came into place, and we wrote to that minister and asked him to tell us, please, what the status of that strategy was. Were we going to meet again? Was he going to sign it off? We were told he will not meet with us and nothing else. That was February. It's now nearly July, and we still really haven't heard what's happening with that. So this is a common practice of a piece of work is started, political circumstances changed, and it's dropped. And you're asked continually for your input, but you never see that input being reflected in the outputs coming from government. And it goes again to your point about having no regard to opposition days. There's a different culture in the Assembly to in this House, and indeed in normal functioning parliaments everywhere, which is there's no regard to the issues raised by opposition, Opposition is in fact not the normal state of affairs. Very often you've got nearly all the big parties in government together. So they aren't really holding each other to account, but they're having a very siloed approach. So this is communities, this is finance, this is health, and all like as separate as possible. They're quite protective over what's in their area, and whenever a new piece of work appears, nobody wants to take responsibility for it because they're kind of squaring things off. And anything that has to be shared among departments goes to the Executive Office, which used to be called the Office of First and Deputy First Minister. And sometimes that'll get things done. Other times that's the site of the collapse. That's the cause of the collapse, is relations within that office. So you can never be sure when you begin a piece of work that it's going to be seen through to the end, successfully or otherwise. And that goes to as well your point about the civic panel. That's never appeared. It's never been discussed. There was never any move towards making it happen. And of course the civic panel was really a little bit like the civic forum, just rebranded and rejigged. But I think the idea is not popular for the same reason that even they don't give regard to the duly elected official opposition.
Thank you very much, Elaine and Helen. And just before I bring in our colleague, Senator Francis Black, could I just ask, as you referred to the Executive Committee, and you know there are committees of the Assembly like we have here.
Yeah.
You're engaging with a committee of the Oireachtas today.
Yeah.
Do you get an opportunity to engage at committee level in public session with the committees of the Stormont Assembly?
Sometimes.
The all party groups.
Well, the all party groups are sort of separate, but I've been in front of some committees. It's very hit and miss. It's very difficult to, like, it really depends on who's chairing the committee and what they particularly want to focus on. And since they've come back in February, I've been before one committee, which was the committee of the Executive Office, actually, and it was about the violence against women and girls strategy. But it's very hit and miss, and you really have to do a lot of work to build up that relationship whereby they consider you worthy of coming in to the committee. But with that said, yes, it does depend, but it's probably the most effective route sometimes of getting answers. But usually the minister for that department that you're there to speak about isn't necessarily there. So there will be a separate thing where they write to the minister and they'll ask them questions and so forth. And we also engage through all party, there's quite a lot of all party groups on various issues that we're involved with, and they'd be pretty good at writing to ministers as well for answers about issues like the ones I've raised, what happened to that strategy, etc. But very rarely do you get an answer you get an answer because they have to answer, but it's not really an answer to your question.
And just here in our state, sometimes programmes are funded centrally by government but administered at local level through local authorities. I'm just thinking of, you know, with the influx of people from Ukraine and other countries over the last few years, in particular, additional resources have been given to our local authorities and to other local statutory agencies to deal with some of the particular issues and to provide new community facilities and that. Now, our local authorities are the decision makers in regard to where that funding is dispersed, etc. Do the local authorities have any programmes, funding streams to support the work of yourselves and others?
Yeah, so we would have some would come through that as well, and we also have the City of Sanctuary in Belfast as well, which has been really good, a good project. So there are some of those mechanisms that it comes through, but I think even with council level, things can be very majority rule, and that's
the point I was just coming to, Helen. Is that still the same modus operandi?
very much. We feel it is very much so, yeah.
Because I thought maybe at local level you'd have a fairness in the allocation of resources.
No, if you've got the support of a political party, then you've got more say when it comes to asking for the money, and you know you're going to move higher up the chain, so it can still apply, yeah.
And arguably sometimes it's worse at local level because it doesn't have the same scrutiny as the Assembly has, and you know I'm thinking of particular schemes that have been rolled out, for example, by Belfast City Council, which is you know where I live. There was one around fuel poverty hardship the winter before last, and they used the same organisations for dispersing within the communities, and that's the city divided into north, east, south, west, that they had used for a different piece of funding around COVID. They didn't open it up to kind of public interest, and then an awful lot of that money that was dispersed into the 4 areas, it went to organisations with connections maybe to some degree with various political parties, but the money was dispersed not in a first come, first served kind of way in some cases. There were people queuing outside in horrendous weather, it was the depths of winter, to try and get a voucher, and most of the vouchers had been allocated before the doors opened that morning. There was a lot of anger and frustration, a good bit of media attention because it was so public, and a lot of people went directly to the media. But that kind of thing, that pattern, repeats itself on a regular basis. Now, having said all of that, there are some pieces of funding, like some councils will have, for example, gender equality kind of work, that does open itself widely, and it does include our organisations among many, many others, and is dispersed with a degree of fairness that is good. But it's those kind of should be open to everyone in the public kind of ones that are filtered through, instead of one organisation that maybe has an oversight into poverty and is distributing on the basis of need. It often goes to ones that are deeply connected with elements of the local community that make it less fair for members of the public trying to access it.
Yeah, to my knowledge, all schemes that would be operated by our local authorities, they have to be publicly advertised, and there's a that meet, either your application meets with the criteria or it doesn't. That it's allocated. It's not allocated on the basis of politics or a weighting towards a particular region. It has to be publicly advertised, and all applicants then duly considered, analysed, and allocate on the basis of the quality of the application and the success. To my knowledge, anyway.